this is a topic that is of tremendous interest and importance to me. And I've been giving a lot of thought to the talk, the title of which, as you heard, is Influencing Change. Now, I have a confession to make. I give a fair number of talks, and very often the talk that you give isn't exactly the talk that was advertised. And this is one of those talks. So you book these things many months in advance, and you do your research, and you talk to the sponsors of the event, and you write, and you've got your talk prepared, and then you show up at the event, and you see what's on the program, and you talk to the people, as I did at the reception last night, and you go, uh-oh, this isn't quite as advertised. And in this case, I'd rather have deliberately strayed off of the original topic, because the topic is influencing change. And I do want to talk about how Aboriginal, First Nations people, especially the people in this room, can influence change. But I also want to talk about how change is influencing you. So it's not just about influencing change, it's about change influencing. I believe that there are hugely important demographic shifts underway in this country. And they are going to have an enormous, they're already having, and will have an even greater importance going forward over the coming years. These changes are going to have a profound impact on the relationship between Aboriginal Canadians and the larger Canadian society. I'm not sure that everyone in the Aboriginal community understands this. I'm not sure especially that the leadership of First Nations, of non-status Indians, of Métis and Inuit fully understand the changes that are coming and the impact that those changes are going to have on them and on their relationship to the larger Canadian society. And that's why I feel it's important that I talk about those changes today. Now, I'm acutely aware of the fact that I'm in the wrong room to be giving this speech. The young men and women here today have pursued their educational dreams and are on the cusp of launching their professional careers. And I congratulate each and every one of you for doing that, and I congratulate the business leaders who are helping to launch those careers here today and through this event. You deserve high praise for it, all of you. But I also believe and hope that many of you are now and will continue to be leaders within your own communities, especially in the years going forward, whether that's formally in the role of participating in, say, First Nations governance, or informally as exemplars within your community for what is possible. So you are the future of those communities, and the decisions that First Nations and other Aboriginal leaders make are going to have a great impact upon that future. As I've said, I believe over the coming years, the relationship between Canada's Aboriginal peoples and the larger Canadian community is about to undergo a major shift. Here's the news. That shift is not going to increase the influence of the Aboriginal community on the larger Canadian society. It may even diminish the influence of the Aboriginal community on the larger society. Either way, this change is coming. Now, I also recognize, and this is important for me to recognize, that I do not make these claims based on my own experiences living within Aboriginal communities. I am the guy sitting behind the desk in Ottawa who makes grand pronouncements on things that he actually has very little first-hand experience with. And I know that's pretty ridiculous. It's also how Aboriginal policy gets made in this country. That's not right, but that's how it is. And one of the things that sitting behind a desk all day and looking at reports allows you to do is it gives you a chance to look at statistics. I'm very fond of looking at statistics, although my math teachers in high school would be astonished to hear this. In fact, everything that I say to you today is based on a few basic statistics that you can check for yourself anytime if you want to by going onto the Statistics Canada website or just by Googling it. As you know, the Aboriginal population in this country is growing rapidly, both on reserve and off reserve. The Inuit, the Métis, non-status Indians are growing in population as well as the First Nations. In fact, if you put it all together, the Aboriginal population in this country is expected to double from about 1 million in 2001 to about 2 million in 2031. That's a huge increase. And we know why that population will increase. Aboriginal women used to have a great many more children than other Canadians. Note that I said used to have. A population, if it's going to sustain itself, has to have 2.1 babies per woman in the course of each generation. I know that's an astonishing feat, having 2.1 babies, but statistically, that is how many children each generation needs to produce in order to sustain the population of that generation. If you have more than 2.1 on average, your population grows. If you have less than 2.1 each year, that population starts to decline. Now, back in 1970, the larger population, the birth rate in the larger population was declining rapidly. We had gone through the baby boom after the Second World War, and now, after that baby boom, the population, the birth rate in the general population had declined to about 2.1. We had about a stable population in terms of birth rate. But in 1970, the Aboriginal birth rate was 5.7 children, almost 3 times as high as the original population, as the general population. 3 times the replacement rate means a large, swiftly growing population. And that's what we have today. We have a large Aboriginal population, half of which is under 25 years of age, thanks to the birth rates that were underway in the Aboriginal population in 1970. Today, the national fertility rate, as it's called, is 1.5 children per woman. That's not enough to sustain the population of the country. On its own, a country with a fertility rate of 1.5 will start to decline in population. The birth rate among the Aboriginal community is 2.3 children per woman. That's about 50% higher than the overall population, but it's still much lower than it was in 1970. In fact, it's down to about replacement rate. That means that after this generation of young Aboriginal Canadians grows up and stops having children, if they sustain a 2.3 birth rate, the Aboriginal population will then stabilize. It will not grow. It'll be the same number of people every year. And in fact, since the fertility rate has gone from 5.7 down to 2.3 over the course of the last 40 years, there's no reason to believe it won't continue dropping. Aboriginal birth rates will follow the general population and start to drop below the replacement rate of 2.1. Now, this isn't just something that's happening in Canada. This is happening all around the world, and it's terrific news. Fertility rates are at or below replacement rates in India, of all places, and China. They're below replacement rates in Latin America and Southeast Asia. As women gain more control over their bodies, as they get better educated and obtain more rights, one of the first things they start to do is have fewer babies. As families move from rural environments into cities, they also stop having as many children. They don't need them to work the farms. And for the first time in human history, more people now live in cities around the world than live in the countryside. In fact, the only place on Earth today where the fertility rate is above the replacement rate is in sub-Saharan Africa and in the Islamic Middle East. And even there, the latest data shows that there is a substantial decline in fertility rates in these last 2 places. So we talk a lot about overpopulation, global overpopulation, and it is a problem. But there's another thing coming at us. If current trends continue, and they've been carrying on the same way for decades, by 2040, the global population is going to start to decline. For the first time in history, probably since the Black Plague at least, the overall population on the planet will start to go down. That will have tremendous opportunities, especially to improve the quality of the environment. It'll also have tremendous challenges, but it's going to happen. So if the Canadian fertility rate is below the replacement rate, and has been for some time, does that mean the Canadian population is about to decline? It is already declining in some parts of the world. In Japan, there are fewer people in Japan every year. There are countries in Europe where the population is already starting to go down. But it's not going to happen in Canada. Our population in 2031 will be slightly higher than it is right now. Why is that? Well, you know the answer. Immigration. There is no country on earth as dedicated to the policies of immigration as this country is. We bring in more people per capita than any other developed nation on earth, 250,000 people every year. That's the population of Toronto every decade. Every decade we are bringing in Toronto. We're bringing in, for example, twice as many people on a per capita basis as the United States. So let's put these numbers together. In 2001, the total Aboriginal population of Canada represented about 3% of the population. But the Aboriginal population is growing and the general population is not. So today, it's believed that the Aboriginal population is somewhere around 4%. It's gone up from 3 to 4%. And by 2031, it will be somewhere between 4% and 5%. It will top out around 2031 at 5% of the overall population, and it will then stabilize. And in fact, at that point, in terms of the overall population, it might start to go down. The overall population, though, in 2031 will be very, very different from the population today. Because these 250,000 people that we were bringing in every year, this city of Toronto that we are importing every decade, or if you want to put it another way, the entire Aboriginal population of the country that is being brought in every 4 years, are almost all from developing countries. They're almost all, in fact, from Asia. Some from the Caribbean, very few from Latin America, some from the Middle East and Africa, but almost all from Asian and Pacific nations. And in fact, 3 countries, China and India and the Philippines, account for 35% of all the immigrants that we are bringing in right now. And that, again, is a trend that's going to continue. So by 2031, it is believed that about a third of the entire Canadian population will be what Statistics Canada calls visible minority. That is to say, not Caucasian and not Aboriginal. In the cities, the skew is going to be even higher. By 2031, in Toronto, the Greater Toronto Area, 63% of the entire population will not have been born in Canada. Think of that. Almost 2/3 of the population of the GTA will not have been born in Canada. The Aboriginal population of the GTA will be 0.5% at that point. In Vancouver, the foreign-born population will be 59%, and the Aboriginal population will be at around 3%. So now we have to leave the realm of statistics. We have to look at this world that will exist, this Canada that will exist in 2031. This Canada that is still bringing in 250,000 people every year, almost all of them visible minorities, almost all of them from Asia, most of them living in the large cities, becoming, in fact, the majority population within the large cities. At this point, we leave the realm of statistics and we start to enter the realm of speculation. This, then, is my personal speculation on the impact that this is going to have. I believe it's informed speculation, but you can decide that for yourself. The people who are coming here now, the people who will be dominating our cities, already in Toronto, it's 46% foreign-born even today, come from a very different background from my background. They come from a very different background from the Europeans who came here and colonized this country in the 17th and 18th and 19th and 20th centuries. These new arrivals themselves come from a colonial background. And they're going to empathize with the challenges facing the Aboriginal population because their societies endured exactly the same challenges. They come from countries that were colonized by Europeans. They were displaced from their land. They were robbed of their wealth. And their societies today are struggling to reclaim the growth and the ownership that they possessed in the years before they were colonized, now that they are once again independent nations. So there will be an empathy, an understanding between the new arriving Canadians and the Aboriginal population. But that empathy will have limits. After all, these Canadians will not be the descendants of oppressors. They were, in fact, the descendants of the oppressed. Their willingness to accommodate the demands of First Nations and other Aboriginal peoples will be limited. I believe it will be more limited than the current population is willing to today. Governments depend for their political survival already on immigrant voters. I did a study of the last election, the May 2nd election that is a year ago yesterday, that brought Stephen Harper his majority government. And the Globe looked at 20 ridings in the GTA that we knew statistically had large immigrant populations. Now, immigrant Canadians almost always voted Liberal. They voted Liberal decade after decade after decade. But the new immigrants are increasingly voting Conservative. And in the 12 ridings that had the largest immigrant population in the GTA. These are ridings in the cities of Brampton and Mississauga, Ajax, Pickering, Vaughan. Every single one of those ridings switched in the last election from Liberal to Conservative. The immigrant vote in Canada is shifting from Liberal to Conservatives. The Conservatives know that they depend for their government today, their majority government today, on immigrant voters in the GTA and to a lesser extent in the lower mainland of British Columbia. That's true today. It's only going to get more true in the years to come. And governments listen to those who voted them in. This could mean over the coming years that it will be more and more difficult to get federal and provincial governments to engage politically on the agenda of Aboriginal peoples, because the voters themselves, who are immigrants from third world countries in the Pacific and Asia, are themselves less interested in and less engaged in that agenda. And they will become, I fear, increasingly impatient with many of the claims and demands and rights that are asserted by First Nations and other Aboriginal peoples. Now, luckily, many of these claims and rights are protected constitutionally and through the decisions of the courts. But it's also been my experience that a determined population confronting an inconvenient law finds a way around that law. And again, over time, I believe that the impact of immigration is not going to have a positive effect on the Aboriginal agenda. It may, in fact, even have a negative effect. I'm not saying that this is a good thing, and I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I am saying it's a thing. Now, I raise this because I believe the demographic changes that are coming to this country, that are already underway, lend an urgency to the issue of reforming the situation within the Aboriginal community, particularly the situation of First Nations on reserves. Now, I know as well, because I have in fact visited many of them, that the experiences on reserves differ greatly from region to region, and they can differ greatly even from one reserve to another reserve nearby. Nonetheless, we know overall that there are too many communities in this country, too many First Nations, that are beset with challenges of inadequate housing, with high crime rates, with unacceptable rates of illness and disease and substance abuse, and lack of education. Even without the political impact of immigration patterns, the need for change is urgent just for that very reason. I'm saying here today that I believe that the situation is particularly urgent because there's a window of opportunity that is about to open. But that window of opportunity will be finite. And if it is not seized upon, it's going to close. I'm not sure that Aboriginal leaders, especially First Nations leaders, fully understand the urgency of that situation, the potential of that window, and the danger, if they do not act, that the window will close. It is not well known, and in fact, it's not even official. But I can tell you, based on what me and my business call informed sources, that the Harper government has decided to bring down a First Nations Education Act. It's probably going to come down in the fall. It is going to offer powerful new opportunities to improve the quality of education on reserves. Now, this may surprise you because, like you, I have never thought of the Harper government as one that is tremendously dedicated to the issue of making First Nations, the improvement of the lives of the First Nations, top of the agenda. After all, it was the Harper government that torpedoed the Kelowna Accord that Paul Martin's Liberals signed. In fact, the last thing Paul Martin did as Prime Minister was sign the Kelowna Accord and then call an election, and of course he was promptly defeated. And the first thing the Conservatives did was torpedo the Accord, probably just because it was written by Paul Martin. But there was still a tremendous opportunity lost. I was a huge supporter of the Kelowna Accord because I believe whatever you thought of the individual recommendations and agreements within it, we were dedicating $5 billion to improving the quality of life, especially the quality of life on reserve, through education, through healthcare, through housing. And that was a $5 billion opportunity that was lost. And so, under the Harper government, First Nations and Aboriginal issues just receded into the background. Except that they didn't quite. After all, it was the Harper government that issued the formal apology and created the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to deal with the tragedy of the residential schools. And it was the Harper government that signed, because the Liberal governments would not, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So there was movement. And it became increasingly clear to a few of us in Ottawa over the course of the last year and a half that the Harper government was looking hard at the issue of First Nations education reform. Why were they looking hard at it? Well, I believe it was pure cold calculation. The Aboriginal population is growing. The Aboriginal population is young. Half of the Aboriginal population is under 25. There is a labor shortage. And the quality of education that too many Aboriginal people are receiving is inadequate. As a result, we're bringing people in to fill jobs that are going begging in Canada, even as we have high levels of unemployment among Aboriginal Canadians. The way to fix this, I believe the Harper government concluded, is to break the paradigm and to change the nature of the education system, especially the nature of the education system on reserves. There is a parallel that a lot of people draw when talking about First Nations education on reserve. It resembles, they say, a 19th century township. Let's say a 19th century township here in Alberta. So in the 19th century, if you were a farmer and you lived in a township, your township had a local government. It had a reeve and a couple of councillors who would look after the roads, look after the various issues that township had to deal with. And one of the things that they had to deal with was the school. And they would raise rates among the farmers, and they'd build a school. And the reeve of the township would be responsible for hiring a teacher, and the teacher would teach the kids in the school. And then when the teacher left, they'd hire somebody else. And that's how the vast majority, it's how my mother and father, as a matter of fact, were educated. They spent 8 years of schooling in small schools in rural areas, in this case in central Ontario, leaving, of course, to do the harvest in the fall. And at grade 8, you quit and you went out and you worked. That's how First Nations education on reserve is largely performed today. It is the 19th century rural township model. But of course, the larger education system is profoundly different from that. We don't educate kids that way anymore. We have school boards, which govern numerous townships, or more appropriately, cities, including large cities. And the boards decide where the schools need to go and what needs to be in those schools. The boards hire the principals and the teachers to manage those schools. And then above the board, there's a whole provincial Ministry of Education, which sets the curriculum and the standards for teaching and certifies teachers. So you have a big infrastructure that's there to ensure that the quality of education in every school across the province is at a certain minimum level. And then, in fact, there's not much of a gap between the worst school in New Brunswick, say, and the very best public school in New Brunswick. That's how the 20th and 21st century education system works. So the Harper government decided to convene a panel. It was under the leadership of YMCA CEO Scott Haldane. 3-person panel, and it was given a year to come up with a new model for Aboriginal education. The Haldane panel got a fair bit of publicity, but people didn't notice that at the same time there was another panel underway in the Senate, led by Senator St. Germain, who many of you know. And it happened that the Senator St. Germain's panel landed in December, and the Haldane's panel's report landed in February. And a couple of us looked at it and said, you know what, it's the same report. It has both reports have almost exactly the same recommendations. And in Ottawa, when 2 different reports come to the same conclusion, you perk up your ears. The reports basically recommended the creation of First Nations school boards. In other words, they wanted to bring to on-reserve schools the same kind of superstructure that exists for the larger schools today. And their precedent for that exists partly in Nova Scotia, where the Mi'kmaq have created a provincial school board. The school board is native-run. It is funded from Ottawa with some provincial assistance. The school board sets the curriculum. The school board decides what schools go where and how much money goes to each school. The school board hires the principals and the teachers. And it sets a curriculum that is administered across all of the schools in the province. The curriculum meets the provincial standards, which is why the provincial government, Nova Scotia government, is involved in this program. But it also has a very heavily native-centric curriculum, including native language training. So the idea is to get into the schools on the Mi'kmaq reserves in Nova Scotia a quality of education as good as anything that is being received outside those reserves, to test the students as rigorously as they are tested off reserve, to have teachers who are as well qualified and as well paid on reserve as off-reserve. And it's starting to produce results. It's early years yet, but there are strong signs of improving test scores and improving graduation rates among the Mi'kmaq in Nova Scotia. And you would expect that. If you had a school board system for the First Nations in a province that was as good as and identical to, though culturally specific, to the general system, why wouldn't you have results that are as good? And indeed, British Columbia is moving quickly to create a similar system. So what the Haldane report recommended and what the St. Germain report recommended is, let's do it nationally. Let's offer, because it has to be voluntary, it cannot be imposed, let's offer to all of the reserves school boards. They could be provincial if the province is small enough. They could be regional if the province is too large. But they would be run along the same principles. Federally funded, with a common curriculum, though one tailored to the specific needs of First Nations on reserves, with standards and pay for teachers that matched that of the larger general population. That's what the Haldane report recommended. That's what the St. Germain report recommended. I can tell you those recommendations have been taken to heart, and that the government is determined to move forward with an Indian Education Act, a First Nations Education Act, I think it will actually be called for once, that offers this model for First Nations across the country to take or not to take as they see fit. There will be a carrot. The carrot will be that there will be increased funding for those First Nations that join these school boards. One of the problems in Aboriginal education, and there are many problems in Aboriginal education, is that the federal funding for schools on reserves has only been going up by 2% a year, which isn't even the rate of inflation many years, and is certainly not nearly as high as the rate of increase for provincial schools. So while provinces have been funding their schools at 6% a year in many years, increases, the feds have only been doing it at 2% a year. So no wonder there's a gap. And no wonder that contributes to the core statistic, which is at the root of all of this, which is that First Nations graduation rates on reserve are 40%, less than half of the national graduation average. That is the core statistic. Less than half as many First Nations on reserve are graduating from high school as are graduating the general population. And that's the statistic that, as I said, the Harper government is out to change. Not because of the better angels of their nature, although if you're a fervent Tory supporter, you can say that it is, but because of the cold hard reality that that's a workforce that is not being fully exploited. So that is the opportunity that I talked about at the beginning of the speech. That is the window that is opening. A First Nations Education Act that is going to be arriving, according to reliable sources, this fall. This act is going to be strongly opposed. Many First Nations chiefs boycotted the Haldane report from the get-go. In fact, I believe the entire First Nations in Saskatchewan boycotted it. There were also Quebec chiefs and Ontario chiefs who boycotted it. And they boycotted it for a variety of reasons. One, some objected to the fact that Mr. Haldane was not himself Aboriginal. They objected to the speed with which the panel was put together. They objected to the short timeline it had to produce a report. Some of them said, well, we already have reports. Why do we need another report? Some of them objected to the fact that this report was co-sponsored by the Assembly of First Nations. In fact, this was the first time that the Assembly of First Nations and the federal government had jointly co-authored and co-sponsored a panel on education. And within the political community, because I'm a political reporter, there is a resistance to Sean Atleo, the national chief, and a belief that anything that Sean Atleo supported, they should oppose, was also behind some of the resistance to this report. Because guess what? There is politics even within the First Nations community. So as there was resistance to the Haldane report in the first place, I am expecting that there is going to be great resistance to the act itself. Because, well, I would say there are two reasons. One is historical and one is current and political. The historical objection is well-grounded. The residential schools and the other abuses that were perpetrated upon First Nations over the years have left many First Nations leaders, and even many First Nations mothers and fathers, suspicious of educational initiatives coming from Ottawa. They have good reason to be suspicious of educational initiatives coming from Ottawa. A lot of those initiatives have been very, very bad. And they're right to worry that it is yet another attempt to assimilate First Nations into the larger society. And I understand that objection, though I believe that objection can be answered on the grounds that these new school boards will themselves be fully operated and governed by First Nations. But the other reason why there will be objections is that those First Nations that join these school boards will lose control over education on their own reserves. So if money is coming for education to a particular reserve, which dispenses those funds as it sees fit, that money will no longer be coming. And so for many First Nations leaders, this will result, they fear, in a loss of sovereignty over their reserves, ceding of sovereignty to some bureaucracy in some provincial capital somewhere, and they fought too long and too hard to obtain that sovereignty to surrender it now. I think that is an understandable objection, but I think it's an unfortunate one. I believe that we all, in this, of all rooms across the country, there is an understanding of how important it is that we break the paradigm on First Nation education, that we get graduation rates up, that we get school attendance on reserve to match that of the provincial levels, that we get the standardized testing in place to ensure that First Nation students are getting as good an education as anyone else in the population. I am not a supporter of the government. I'm a reporter. It is not for me to oppose or support any of the actions that any government takes. It's my job to analyze, well, first of all, to find out what's going on and to tell you about it, as I have today, and then to analyze the impact. I believe that, and this is, again, only my opinion, the situation is grave enough on reserves now. There has been no improvement in the First Nations graduation rates in the last 25 years. After all the studies, all the money, such as it is, that has been spent, not one single ounce of improvement in graduation rates on reserve. That surely has to change. We surely have to find a way to break that paradigm. And here is how the federal government is offering to break it. Now, the choice is entirely yours. Of course, none of us have seen this act yet. And when it arrives, we're going to have to look at it, and we're going to have to examine the provisions that are in it. And each of you is going to have to decide whether you can support that act or not support it, and whether there are ways that the act can be changed, because acts just don't arrive and get passed. Acts arrive, and then they spend months going through amendments and revisions in committees and panels and discussions. And this act, above all, is an act that will take a very long time to get passed. So it will be your decision as to whether you want to support the act, whether you want to influence the act. And if the act gets passed, as young leaders of the Aboriginal community and First Nations, and as business leaders who are actively engaged in hiring the graduates of this education system, it will be for you to decide whether to support the act. I think you need to get out there and you need to talk to your parents, you need to talk to your friends, you need to talk to the chiefs on reserve and find out where they are on this act, whether they oppose it or support it, and if they oppose it, why they oppose it, and what they're offering in its stead. I believe if you're not a First Nation on reserve, you also need to watch this act very, very carefully. Because if the paradigm gets broken, if the federal government does move to reform education on reserve, then the next thing that will happen is a groundswell of demands for improved educational quality for Aboriginals who are not on reserves, who are within maybe the public education system, but who are not getting as good a quality of education as others who are non-Aboriginal within the same province. What can be done for them? How can the curriculum be tailored for them? What resources can be made available for them? We need to expand this off reserve and onto the entire Aboriginal spectrum, rural and urban, on reserve and off reserve across the country. This is the window, and by the way, the speech long ago lost any semblance of where I'm supposed to be. This is the choice that you're going to have to make. Change is coming. Demographic change, fundamental demographic change that is going to change the relationship between the broader community and the First Nations of this country and the larger Aboriginal population of this country. The change is not going to always be good for the Aboriginal agenda. But there is an opportunity now, a window is opening now, that could lead to profound changes in the way the next generation of on-reserve and off-reserve First Nations and other Aboriginals are educated, that could finally break the paradigm, that could finally start to eliminate the gap between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal education. That big debate is coming. You can either wait and let change influence you as the nature of this country continues its transformation, or you can get out there now and you can influence this change and make this new window a new opportunity for the generation coming up behind you so that they can have and they can achieve everything that you have achieved here. Thank you.